Okay, we'll start again. So Addison Kubik is the Education and Outreach Coordinator for the Capital Region Partnership for Invasive Species Management, which is PRISM. Addison attended the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry, where he majored in conservation biology with a focus on botany and plant science. So he's going to discuss invasive species, what PRISM is, and some things that you can do to prevent the spread of invasive species. All right, and I'll let you share your screen, Addison.
All right, this is the hard part. Can I get this on the first try? All right, I'm hoping you guys are seeing another version of my face with some words next to it.
Yep.
All right, well, I'll just go ahead and get started. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. As was just mentioned, I am Addison Kubik, the Education and Outreach Coordinator for the Capital Region PRISM. And now, a good first question that you might be asking is, okay, what's a PRISM? And that's a fair question to have if you've never heard of it before. Well, up here on the screen, this is our vision and our mission. And I know it's kind of dry just to read text, but I'm going to go ahead and read it right at you anyway. So our vision is to cultivate a region in which partners work together to address the harmful impacts associated with invasive species to protect its lands and waters, biodiversity, economy, and quality of life. All right, so that's what we want to do. What's our mission? How are we trying to do that? And our mission is to prevent, detect, and respond to harmful invasive species in the PRISM region through collaboration, resource sharing, strategic messaging, and education. This one falls slightly into that last category if you were able to follow. So what exactly do we do? Well, there are 8 PRISMs throughout New York State. It's been split into different regions, and this one is the Capital Region PRISM. I wonder if we can figure out why we decided to call it that. So we are funded by the DEC through the Environmental Protection Fund, and each PRISM throughout the state is hosted by a different organization. We are hosted through the Cornell Cooperative Extension of Saratoga County. So my office is in Ballston Spa, but we work out of an 11-county region, which we're sort of everything sandwiched north of the Catskills and south of the Adirondacks. We have all of this important stuff here. So in my mind, we sort of think of ourselves often as one of the lines of defense as these new species tend to progress from the south up, and we try to get a handle on things before they make it into the Adirondacks, which I'm sure we've all experienced the Adirondacks at least a little bit to know of the magical place that is. So that's sort of the scope of what we do. We are 4 full-time staff that tries to cover this 11-county region. There's me. I'm in charge of all the education and outreach for the region. We have a terrestrial invasive species coordinator. That is Sam Schultz. We have an invasive aquatic coordinator. She does all the water stuff. That's Hannah Coppola. And then we have the lead PRISM coordinator, and that's Chris Williams. He's my boss, and he sort of helps steer the ship and guide us into whatever is going to be the best thing to do. And what we do is I sort of think of us as the hemoglobin in the circulatory system of conservation in the capital region. We don't really have the manpower to do things ourselves, but what we do have is knowledge, tools, and know-how. And we try to connect people that have the manpower, maybe have some of the money, and they want to do the good work, but they don't necessarily know how to go about doing it, because invasive species is a very daunting challenge to try to overcome. And I'm going to try not to get too down and depressing on all of this stuff. I'll at least make jokes along the way if it gets depressing. So I'll try to even us out with levity a little bit. And another thing that we do, in addition to we go out, we teach classes, kind of like this one. I host workshops. I do volunteer events with people. I work with other organizations, and I help train their volunteers. We bring a lot of tools for people to use to help with those volunteer events. We partner with a lot of other state organizations. We do a lot of stuff with state parks. We do a lot of stuff with DEC, Department of Ag and Markets. And we sort of help connect everybody together to make sure that really it's too big of a problem for anybody to tackle on their own. So we try to bring everybody together to make a sort of a more unified front, including professionals, community members, even just people passing through, to be all a part of the solution, because that's the only way that it's going to be a solution, is if we're all stepping up to do it together. Now, what is an invasive species, you may find yourself asking? And we've got a couple of pictures of some high class invaders that some of you may know about. We've got the spotted lanternfly up on the top left, the Asian longhorn beetle right next to that, the world famous emerald ash borer right next to that. And the way that we define an invasive species, and this definition comes from the state legislative definition, is an invasive species is anything that is non-native to the ecosystem under consideration that has the potential to cause harm to the environment, to the economy, to environmental health, or to human health. And a thing that I always like to make sure everybody knows is that invasive species are a global issue, and it is not just a thing that we face here in the United States and here on the Western Hemisphere. We have many invasive species in this country that come from Asia, that come from Europe, and I just always like to remind everybody that there are many species that are great here that are currently very invasive when they get to Asia. For example, we all love goldenrods here. Goldenrods are not so popular over in mainland China, where they are super invasive, because you think about how aggressive goldenrods can be here where they're native. Imagine what they're like when they're somewhere where nothing has any idea how to handle them. And what about an invasive species makes it a threat? How can they harm the environment? Well, there's a lot of different ways that they can do that, and I'm probably not going to get into nitty-gritty with a lot of the specifics, but there's all sorts of ways that invasive species can sort of degrade an environment once they get into it. They have a tendency to be able to outcompete a lot of native species when they get into the area. A lot of invasive species are what we call generalists, meaning that they will feed, if they're predators, they'll feed on a wide variety of different things. If they're herbivores, they'll feed on a wide variety of different plants. If it's a plant, maybe it can grow in a wide variety of different soil types or under different light conditions. And what this allows them to do is then proliferate throughout an environment, and they begin to outcompete the things that were there originally. And a lot of these ecosystems it's sort of like a very delicately balanced house of cards in a lot of ecosystems, where each species represents a card, or might be more like a Jenga set. And each time a species is extirpated from that region, the stability of that Jenga tower just starts to deteriorate a little bit at a time. So it may not be something that you see the impact of right away, but what this does is, by making these environments less stable, they are then less able to withstand other environmental change factors, like the climate beginning to warm, or new invaders or new introductions coming in. And it's also an interesting thing to think about when we consider that as the climate warms, not only do we have potential invasive species being spread through shipping or accidentally via human introductions, we also have a whole new class of species that we call climate refugees that are sort of bumping their way north as things get to inhospitable temperatures for them. So it all becomes a very nuanced, complicated thing to try to figure out how to deal with, especially when some things cause a problem and some things don't cause as much of a problem. And what kind of a problem do they cause? Well, the US economy, and this number is important. This number is from a study done in 2005 that estimated that invasive species cost the US economy $120 billion every year. And that number, adjusted for the current value of the dollar, is a hair under 200 billion a year. And it's also important to note that just adjusting that number for inflation doesn't really address how much more severe the invasive species problem has become over the past 18 or so years, because not only have all of the species that were being studied in that last study had 18 years to proliferate, there has also been 18 years of brand new introductions like the spotted lanternfly or beech leaf disease or the elm zigzag sawfly or many other things, which again I can feel when I'm just being a bummer sometimes, and I'm really trying not to be. There will be snippets of good news in here, I promise. You have my word. I'm not going to be all doom and gloom. Now, I've talked a little bit about an invasive species, so maybe it'll be good to really quickly just define the other side of the coin so that we all know what we're talking about. So obviously, the opposite of an invasive species would be a native species, and that is just anything. We define a native species as anything that was indigenous to the region before European settlement. So basically anything that has been on this continent for a long time, co-evolved with a lot of other stuff. And then broadly under that, we have non-native species, and that's a very wide encompassing umbrella term that, as I'm sure you can all guess, is anything that is not a native species. And under that, I'll go into a little bit of the specifics. And then also we have a nuisance species, and that is generally anytime somebody refers to something as a weed, that's not really a scientific term. That just means I don't like that plant growing in that place. I'm going to get rid of it. So a weed can be a native species. A weed can be anything that you don't like wherever it is. Some people consider poison ivy a weed, which, I mean, poison ivy bums me out, but it has its ecological services and purposes. And now here we get to some of those under the category of your non-natives. An ornamental species doesn't have to be a non-native species, but more often than not, your ornamentals, which are anything that people grow just because they like the way it looks, more often than not, these ornamental species, especially in gardens, tend to be exotic species either from tropical or subtropical regions that just tend to have a little showier flower action than what might be accustomed to in this area. A naturalized species, that's something that's non-native to the environment, has made it into the environment, and is able to sustain its populations unassisted, but doesn't cause systemic harm to the environment. So naturalized means it's out there, it's part of the ecosystems, but it's not eroding the foundation of those ecosystems out from under them. A sleeper species, that's a newer term that we're sort of still in the process of trying to understand what is and what isn't. But essentially, a sleeper species is anything that is currently naturalized, but we think that as the climate shifts, it could change environmental factors just enough for it to sort of awaken into being an invasive species and start to act more invasively. And then lastly, under the umbrella of non-natives, we have the invasives, which I've talked about already and will continue to do so for quite a while. So what are some of the characteristics of an invasive species? And some of this is stuff that I touched on a few minutes ago, talking about sort of their generalist nature. Another thing that's important to think about, and I sort of mentioned this on the topic of the goldenrod as well, is that when a species leaves an area that it's evolved in and it gets to a new area, it's what's called a novel species, meaning that nothing else in that area has any experience dealing with that. So any predators that may have been holding that population in check, or any herbivores that held that species in check in its native range, suddenly there's no analogs for it to get into this range. So maybe it evolved a really high reproductive capacity to deal with being in an area with really high herbivory. And then it gets to a novel ecosystem where it doesn't have that pressure of herbivory on it, and that incredibly high reproductive rate leads to very rapid colonization, very rapid growth, very rapid expansion, and just sort of an overwhelming of new ecosystems. Think of something like how the spongy moth tends to act when it gets in its really high population levels here. There's so many, and there's nothing that feeds on it specifically enough that it's going to be able to do anything to tack those numbers down. I sort of mentioned their generalist nature. Sometimes even they'll have a lower nutritional value and just not have the same other things won't want to eat them as much. And it's one interesting little caveat to invasive species that I always think is really important is and I'm going to try not to diatribe about this for too long, but this is a thing that I feel very passionate about. The interactions between the white-tailed deer and invasive species and native plants. In a lot of situations, the white-tailed deer is one of the most damaging factors to forests I can't speak for I really only know forests in the Northeast, so I'm going to keep my verbiage to just that. But not only have we extirpated most of the predators for the white-tailed deer, we have fragmented habitat and forest stands that greatly favor the white-tailed deer's increased production. And then we have invasive species that come in, take over an area, and then the deer will preferentially not feed on the invasive species because they're not familiar with them or they're unpalatable. So then you have native species pushed into even smaller populations, and then these smaller populations have even higher browse pressure on them from the deer, and it creates this vicious 1-2 punch where the native plants are hit twice as hard by anything else would be without the pressure of the deer in them as well.
Oh,
exactly. And then
hold on 1 second. We obviously have an intruder. Josh, how do you get rid of somebody? Sorry. Wait a minute. Hold on 1 second, Addison. Sorry about that.
no worries.
I
You've
should.
muted everyone.
What's that?
You've muted everyone, right?
I muted, but he came in later, but we need him out. Wait a minute. Is there a way that you just dismiss somebody? Okay, well. Mute. All right, well, let's carry on.
Okay, word.
Addison.
So, as I was saying, as these things get to areas where they continue to outcompete natives, eventually, one of the worst case scenarios that you can have is a monoculture. And a monoculture, if you just sort of think about the root of those words, mono meaning one, culture meaning group of things, a monoculture is just one species that has completely overrun an entire area. And here we've got some pictures up in the top right. That is all garlic mustard. This red stuff down in the middle, that is all an invasive species called burning bush. Down in the bottom right, you may not think it, but you are actually looking at a river that is completely overrun with the invasive species water chestnut, which is kind of insane how thick it gets. I've seen squirrels run across rivers on top of water chestnut. And then on the bottom left is one of the old staples of invasive species everywhere, and that is purple loosestrife, which was at one point the most common wetland plant in all of the United States, which was bad. And these monocultures can do a lot of things. Obviously, things can't grow. If you look at that picture of the garlic mustard on the top right, I don't think any maple saplings are going to be able to overcome that light competition at that really low level. And when you have a monoculture that intentionally, especially with some of these species, you can begin to change the soil composition, alter the pH of the soil, changing what is able to grow there, alter the soil hydrology. Maybe that soil used to hold water really well, but now a new invasive species comes in, leaches all the water out of it, and you have a much more dry soil than you originally had. And also, just lower biodiversity relates to less stability environmentally. And in New York State, we have invasive species split into two groups. There is the prohibited species, and this is the more severe category that we have for invasive species. And these cannot be knowingly possessed with the intent to sell, import, purchase, transport, or introduce. In addition, no person shall propagate prohibited invasive species. This all comes with a hefty fine if anything is found out about these. By the way, both of these two books are available free on our website, capitalregionprism.org. You can check them out there in PDF form, or you can just email me and I can send you those PDFs also if you're interested. The other type is regulated, and this is sort of in that middle ground where we know it's a problem, but we're still allowing some people to use it. Some people can sell it. It's usually has to be identified as potentially invasive once it's regulated in order to be sold. I don't love it, but they didn't ask me to make the rules. I just follow them. And it's also important to note that these lists were all updated the last time in 2014, and a lot has happened in the past 9 or so years, and they are currently working on, we're hoping new versions of these books will be out sometime within the next year or two. And within New York State, every invasive species is ranked on a scale of 100 to sort of estimate potential for damages and severity. That's the scoring system right there. I'm not going to go into too much detail about it, but obviously ecological impact is the most important thing. And there's several categories there where we decide how invasive something may or may not be. And then they're sort of broken down into these broad categories. Obviously, very high is a score of 80 or higher, and then it gets slowly less severe moving down from there. And I've got a picture later. There's like some very high severity things would be like your Japanese knotweed. Down in the south, kudzu is a really large problem. They call it the vine that ate the South. And if you've ever driven through Virginia in the spring or in the summer, boy howdy, they were not lying. It is kind of bananas. It's impressive to look at, but it's kind of bananas at the same time. And if you want to know exactly what invasive species are in your area, you can go to the New York State Invasive Species Tiers list. If you just Google that phrase, it'll take you there. This is via the New York Natural Heritage Program. And that's the link for it down at the bottom of the page as well. So if you just want to take a picture of this slide, that'll take you to that. And from this page, you can select any of the 8 PRISM geographies. Then you can even bar down your searches even more if you want to look just for what's in a terrestrial plant, animal, aquatic plant, what tier it is. So that's a super useful resource if you just want to get an idea of what the things are in your area. And I'll go over some of them as well. And then importantly, everything in the state that's an invasive species is ranked via one of these tiers. And I will just briefly explain them right here. So we have on this graph, the bottom axis is time going over to the right. The axis on the right is control cost, and the axis on the left is area infested. Down in the bottom left, we have our tier 1 plant. Tier 1 species, these are things that are not here yet, meaning that prevention is still a feasible goal. And prevention is always cheaper and easier than getting something out. It's always easier to stop it from coming in than it is to try to get it out once it's in here. So that's tier 1. And that's when we look at sort of what's in the surrounding states right now, what's in the surrounding PRISMs that isn't here yet that we should start to be monitoring for. How do we monitor that? But sometimes things slip through the cracks, as they often do. And that's when we enter into tier 2, which is eradication, when a species is present, but present in low enough levels and in localized enough areas that we believe that eradication is a feasible goal, meaning we can go in there and completely remove whatever the species in question is. Sometimes that doesn't work. And then we get to tier 3, which is containment. And that just means that, okay, it's here, it's in this property. We don't think we're going to be able to get it out of this property. Let's focus to keeping it within this property, not letting it spread. Sometimes you have to change your tactics there. And then eventually things get to tier 4, and that's your really common invasive species that are basically so ubiquitous and so widespread that they're no longer feasible to be managed on a widespread level. And these become managed more on a more specific localized situation. Like Oriental bittersweet is a tier 4 throughout the capital region PRISM. But if you zoom in onto one property that doesn't have it, it's a tier 1 in that one property. So that's sort of the way you have to focus your efforts on that. Is it worth our time? Is there something here worth protecting where this tier 4 species is? Is this a valuable piece of land that people want to use? Is there aesthetic value? Those are the things we have to decide when we're trying to triage our efforts if we want to go after a tier 4 species. And here is just a quick example of some of the different common invasive species and where they rank. There we have bittersweet on the left. That comes in at an 87, which if you've ever dealt with it, it's a real pain in the keister. Periwinkle in the middle there, that one, technically an invasive species. It does spread, but it doesn't really spread that aggressively or that quickly, broadly speaking, and definitely not compared to the 2 that it's being sandwiched by. Kudzu over on the right, luckily not a real problem here at this time, but it is always something that we want to be on the lookout for. And the most invasive species, at least to my knowledge and opinion, in New York State is Japanese knotweed. And on that scale of 100, I believe the score that knotweed has is either a 98 or a 99. And unlike your math test in 11th grade, this is not one you want a high score on. That's the type of score you want golf scoring on. The lower, the better. So that's a little bit of broad background. Now I'm going to go into a few plant profiles. I'm going to talk to you about some of the more common invasive plants, some of their features, how to identify them, why they're a threat, and then some things that you can do if you have these on your property. And I'm starting with the worst one so that we can get it out of the way. Japanese knotweed is, boy howdy, is it a real son of a gun if you're trying to get rid of it. So Japanese knotweed, a lot of people refer to it as bamboo because it's very it has a very bamboo visual sort of feature to it. It's a large shrub. It gets to be about 10 feet tall and wide. And it's got these really long hollow stems, and that's where the bamboo comparisons that a lot of people have come into play. Its most distinguishing characteristic is these really broad, they sort of range from being deltoid, meaning triangle shaped, to more of an oval, but they've all got that sort of acuminate tip on the end of the leaf. These leaves can be pretty big, and they grow in a very conspicuously alternate leaf arrangement. And that paired with its cascading flowers in the summertime, it is, once you get an eye for Japanese knotweed, it's the type of thing where you notice it everywhere, and you will see it everywhere. It's a big one to see on highways, towns. It's a real bummer. And it's got a bunch of flowers, and you think, oh my gosh, what are we gonna do with all these flowers? Well, luckily, almost all of its seeds are completely non-viable. But unfortunately, it is a incredibly vigorous vegetative reproducer, meaning that any part of the plant is capable of regrowing into another plant, which is why if you have Japanese knotweed, mowing it is the worst thing you can possibly do, because that is just spreading thousands and thousands of new propagules into the area, which will then regrow, which is frustrating because that's what almost every municipality does with their knotweed. But also, I mean, what else are you going to do? Things are hard out there. I get it. The world's not perfect. And this becomes a real threat, especially in stream banks. That's my number one place where this becomes a problem environmentally, because not only does it outcompete everything in those stream banks, it has really, really shallow rooting. And in a hilarious fit of irony, it was originally introduced to be a form of erosion control, and it actually makes soil erosion on stream banks so much worse when it's there. And not only that, it then breaks off into the stream and then floats downstream, where it then creates new plants all up and down the stream sides, which is a real bummer. And this one, I have a joke that I always like whenever someone's like, oh, how do I get rid of this Japanese knotweed? My semi-sarcastic answer is, oh, that's really easy. All you have to do is move. That's the only guaranteed way you're going to get rid of your Japanese knotweed. And it is a real pain to try to get rid of. As you can see, that very unfortunate fellow over on the right, that is all Japanese knotweed growing like absolute gangbusters over there. And this is the type of thing that you can really only get rid of with a 3 to 5 year dedicated, committed plan that is going to require a combination of chemical controls, cultural controls, and manual controls. And it's really not easy. It's a very large, not only monetary commitment, but time commitment. And it's frustrating in so much that you can do the whole process and get rid of the knotweed on your property 100%, do everything the right way, and then someone walking on the street just accidentally kicks a piece of knotweed back in your yard, and you have just started all the way back from the beginning. And one of the worst things about knotweed, it has this really deep and strong taproot that grows about 10 feet down, and it can grow about 60 feet out in any direction. And this root is also capable of growing through concrete, which is great if you own a home. That's not what we want. That's not. And in England, actually, Japanese knotweed is considered a hazardous substance, and you can sue a construction company if they bring knotweed onto your house. I would love for us to get there here. I'm not going to go into this too quickly. But if you've got knotweed on your house, I'm sorry, that's really rough. You're going to want to do a multiplicative effort, cut back early summer, do a foliar spray, and that just means spray the plant with chemicals. Glyphosate, Roundup can work. By the way, nothing I say is an endorsement. These are just broad recommendations. And then a stem injection, which isn't easy to get a hold of, but it can be very effective to blast the taproot directly without having to do a bunch of manual work firsthand. But broadly speaking, I'm sorry if you have this. And if you have it and you get rid of it, it is very important to be disposal is a very large factor in invasive species control, because you don't want to do all of this work to remove the knotweed from your property, do a lazy job about it, and then leave a couple pieces and then undo all of that work you just did. That's a bummer. Nobody wants to do that. So don't do that. But now we're going to get to one that is much less of a nightmare to try to get rid of. And that is Euonymus alato winged burning bush, a native to Asia, introduced here to be an ornamental for, I understand why it's an ornamental. It is absolutely gorgeous in the fall. You can see up in the top right that striking red color that it gets its name from. It is a large shrub. It has opposite leaves. So when you have any plant, the first thing to think of is leaf arrangement. Alternate, meaning one per node along the stem, or opposite, coming off right along the same spot, 2 for 2, going all the way up. And you can see that opposite arrangement on the top right picture very conspicuously, but they've got these opposite leaves. They're not that distinct in the most of the year when they're just sort of this green shrub with this red berries that they get, but then the fall happens and they are popping off. This time of the year, you will see them everywhere. They are still very, very common as ornamental plants in people's yards, much to my chagrin. And oftentimes when you have a house with a big burning bush and a large forest across the street, this time of year, you can see all of the young burning bush growing along that forest edge and moving into the forest. They're really, really obvious this time of year, which makes it a good time of year to pull them out if you're doing that. I'm just going to say that. But this is just one of many examples of really pretty thing, but you don't necessarily see the impact that it's having, because that impact usually is extending beyond the scope of your own view. And generally what I find is that nobody is knowingly a part of a problem. Most people that have a burning bush don't know the environmental impact that it actually does end up having. For example, the other day I was surveying out in a very, very rural part of Rensselaer County, near Taconic Ridge State Forest, and I came out of the woods and I had to walk back to the truck. And as I was walking back in the state forest, I walked for maybe half a mile. I counted over 60 seedlings of burning bush growing along the roadside and into the forest, all coming from one very large burning bush that just was in somebody's yard one time a long time ago. And then these things are very heavy fruiters, and fruit is a reproductive opportunity for a plant. So they have a very high reproductive capacity. They can create these very dense monocultures. There's a huge monoculture of burning bush up near Moreau Lake State Park in an area that is trying to be converted into endangered species habitat. It creates this seed shadow where a bunch of seeds drop, and then sort of all around the plant you get a bunch of smaller seedlings growing, and it can sort of propagate and to become this really monstrous looking bush after a certain point. But it's got these really inconspicuous yellow-green flowers during the springtime, and then these bright red fruits. They split open. And burning bush is very, very popular, but it's much easier to control than anything close to what knotweed is like. Burning bush, we've had a lot of success managing it, and a lot of what we do is just, if you cut it back low enough, you can get down to the roots either with a shovel. We use a couple of tools it's like a combination of like a really heavy duty garden hoe and an axe. That's a ton of fun to use. That works great on this. The picture on the right is what's called a a cut stump method of treatment, which is where you just cut it back, and then you've got the exposed plant tissue right there, and you just apply a little bit of herbicide right to that exposure, and that gets pulled down into the root system. That can get rid of the plant. And then the best thing to do is the following year, you do that big work to get rid of the big bush, and this is true of any invasive species. You always want to monitor wherever you took that species out of, because it's a lot easier to go back the next year and pull out a seedling than it is to go back in 5 years and pull out 15 full-size bushes. And a burning bush seedling, you can basically rip it out of the soil with your bare hands. I've done it plenty of times. It's a great time. The kids love it. Everybody has fun. But this one is a lot more feasible to manage, and if you have it in your yard, I would implore you to reconsider. I understand it's very pretty and a great native alternative to burning bush. It's not bright red, but spice bush, Lindera benzoin, is a beautiful native bush, and in the fall it's got this super vibrant golden yellow color that I love. And unlike any invasive plant, it provides good nutrition and value to wildlife. You will have more pollinators in your yard, you will have more songbirds in your yard, and you will make me smile. And don't you want to do that? You don't want to see me cry on a Zoom call on a Thursday afternoon. Nobody wants that. All right, next up, Japanese barberry. I wonder if anybody can guess where this species originates from. This was brought over as an ornamental in 1875, and it's actually interesting. It was brought over because there was a different invasive species of barberry that was here first, but that species became a host for black stem rust, which is a pretty serious pathogen of wheat. So they were like, uh-oh, we better bring over a different barberry because we love barberry so much. So they brought over Japanese barberry, Berberis thunbergii, to be the replacement, and hilariously, now the two species hybridize and it can host black stem rust again, because forethought was hard before science really got the ground under it. I understand. Now, Japanese barberry is a very distinct plant. You can sort of see in that top right picture. I would describe its growth as very tendrily. Like if H.P. Lovecraft designed a shrub, it would be a wild growing barberry. Each sort of branch comes out like a tendril, and along each of those branches, there's a bunch of leaves that are born right on like those stems coming out from that central point. And you can see it a little bit on that picture on the bottom. Their leaves are very distinctly, I think of them as like teardrop shapes. Other people think of them as like little spoons or ladles. The teardrop is what I see, and they form super duper dense stands. You can sort of see in that picture in the middle, all of that reddish hue in that forest understory. That's all barberry. And the worst thing about barberry is that it creates this perfect micro habitat for two distinct animals to interact with each other. Inside of, so not burning bush, Japanese barberry is covered with spines. At every single leaf node, there's a single spine. So the plant is pretty armed, and with inside that plant becomes a great place for the white-footed mouse to live, because the white-footed mouse can get in there and live and thrive without a lot of predators being able to get it. And inside of the barberry bush, it also creates a slightly more humid microclimate. And that humid microclimate favors the black-legged tick, or the deer tick, which is the main vector for Lyme disease to humans. And the interesting thing about Lyme disease is that the ticks, the bacteria that cause Lyme disease, the ticks don't have that naturally. They actually get that bacteria by feeding on a different animal. That animal is the white-footed mouse that also loves to live inside of these bushes. So these bushes create a perfect microhabitat to bring together the main bacterial reservoir for Lyme disease and the main vector for Lyme disease to humans, all in one spot. And according to a study whose name escapes me in this moment, but I can send it to you if anybody's interested, in a comparison of a forest with a understory dominated by Japanese barberry and a forest with an understory dominated by native plants, the forest with barberry had instances of ticks with Lyme disease being about 90% higher than they were in the other forest. And barberry is another thing that I still see very commonly as sort of barrier shrubs in people's houses. It's a thing a lot of people put along the roads when You can do that if you'd like to. What I think it's an ugly plant, but you can do whatever you want on your property. This is America. I don't really care. But I think you should know that if you have it, you are potentially increasing your exposure to Lyme disease via the association with this bush. And there's great alternatives to this. Eastern ninebark is a very similar native plant that gets that purplish hue that barberry has, but it doesn't harbor ticks. And who doesn't love plants that don't have a bunch of ticks in them? Those are my favorite types of plants, the ones that don't have ticks. And it's also a bummer because all of these plants are very heavy fruiters, and the birds will still eat these fruits. But for the most part, the fruits are much less nutritionally valuable to the species of bird that we have here. So the birds are getting more of less nutritional fruit. And there's a lot of long-term things we don't understand about that. Is that going to impact migratory bird behavior when they stop along in their migration, but they're getting food that is less high in fats than what they are traditionally accustomed to? Only time will tell, I suppose. But the good thing about barberry, much easier to get rid of, even in the burning bush. You can just go at the root with a shovel, and it tends to desiccate relatively quickly. You want to be careful when you're pulling it out because of those spines. I always wear work gloves. But if you go at it with the shovel, you can pull it out and then just monitor that spot again, because it's really easy to pull out the extra ones once you get the big one. And if you have a really big bush, you can always go in and just cut it back and then go at the roots after you cut it back, so you can sort of increase your access. Never be afraid to go in with a chainsaw. They're very fun if you know how to use it. Only if you know how to use it properly. They're very dangerous also. So I mentioned this. This is just going to be a really quick thing. This is Big Bend Preserve. This is an area up near Glens Falls, sort of in between Glens Falls and Moreau Lake State Park. This is actually, this slide, the information on this slide is a little bit old. Right now, the parks are currently in the process of trying to get this to be a habitat for the endangered Carner blue butterfly. But you see all of these dots and all of these big blobs. Each of these big blobs represents a different monoculture in this whole area that is, by the way, not really accessed by humans anymore. Up on the top right, that big blob, that is all a dense monoculture of barberry. Though up on the very top center at the bend of that river, that is all invasive bittersweet. Down in the big chunk on that bottom left, that is all an invasive monoculture of black locust. And then there's one more sort of in the center bottom, that is all burning bush. And this is what happens when an invasive species goes to an area and then nobody's there to see what happens until it's too late. And now, let me say, it's not too late. It is just now a really big problem when it could have been a less big problem instead. Really quickly, I'm going to go through this. This is another really big common invasive species, honeysuckles. There's a wide variety of honeysuckles that are all invasive here. They are all functionally exactly the same. And I'm not going to go into the details about the specifics one, but I will tell you how to differentiate them from your native honeysuckles. It's very easy to do. So most of the honeysuckles, again, brought over from either Asia or Europe for their ornamental value. They have a lot more flowers, a lot more fruit than the native ones do, because that's what we wanted them to have. And right now, honeysuckle is, if you go out for like a hike right now, mid to late November, and you see a lot of green on some like shrubby looking bushes, that's probably honeysuckle. Another feature that invasive species have over natives is they tend to have a longer growing season. They'll come out first in the fall, in the spring, and they'll stay around last in the fall. And typically mid to late November isn't green season for most things that have evolved in New York State for thousands of years. So if you see vibrant green on a non-evergreen plant, that could be an indication that maybe what you're looking at has an extended growing season and could be an invasive species. So the leaf shapes are very distinctly egg-shaped. This is another opposite plant, much like the burning bush was. You can see that egg shape on the leaves. The leaves are also, I know this doesn't mean much to people when I just say this because I look at plants all the time, but the leaves look soft, and you're just going to have to trust me on that. But look for that opposite arrangement. The flowers and the berries will always be clustered right at that leaf axis where the leaves are coming off. But the easiest way to differentiate between native and invasive honeysuckle, you see that picture on the right. That shows you the pith, which is the center of a twig, for lack of a better term. And in your native honeysuckles, that pith is solid. In the invasive honeysuckles, the pith is hollow. So if you find something that you think is a honeysuckle, you cut the twig and you look into it. If it looks like a straw, that's invasive. Start going at it. Take your whole day out on it. That's the great thing about managing honeysuckle. I just did a bunch of stuff with some volunteers a couple of weeks ago. And like, if you got some stress issues to work through, honeysuckle is a great plant to take your whole day out on. You just go at it on the roots. A great tool is a honeysuckle popper, which is basically just a long crowbar with like a heavy sheet of wood on it. You pry it under the root ball and you can just, boom, take it out. It's not nearly as easy as I just made it seem. I will be fully honest with you. You're going to break a sweat, but it's going to be a good time. And this is a plant that you can totally remove without any chemicals. You can use chemicals if you choose to, like the cut stump method will work. If you just want to cut it back and apply some chemicals to it, you can do a drill and fill, where you just sort of drill a hole with a drill at an angle and then pipette in some pesticides right into that. But I'm usually a proponent of, I would prefer not to use chemicals unless the situation absolutely demands it. Also because my labor is much cheaper than chemicals are to me. I can work all day and it doesn't cost me a thing. So this is another picture of that, of a cut stump situation. And when the population is low, it's pretty easy to take care of. You can pull them out when they're young. It's when they get big, they get really gnarly, and it just becomes a whole hassle to get rid of. And it's like any of these things, the sooner you start working on it, the better the problem will be. One more quick one, Oriental bittersweet. This came originally from Asia. It is a very, very common invasive species in this area. It is a vine, and this is a twining vine. Different vines have different climbing strategies. Some will send out little tendrils, some will do suction cups. But bittersweet is a straight up twiner, meaning it relies on other things for its actual support and its structure. And it will grow aggressively, twining around itself. That picture on the top right there, that is a bunch of different bittersweet vines all growing around themselves. They do eventually become woody. I have seen bittersweet vines that are as big around as my head, which is impressive. It takes some time. The leaves have what's called a crenate margin on them, meaning that the leaves have teeth, but the teeth are rounded. They're not sharp teeth on the outside. And then it's got an arcuate venation of the leaves, which just means that the veins of the leaf sort of follow the curvature of the leaf as they move. Here you can see some of the different aspects of it. That picture on the right shows it twining around a tree. I have seen an adult tree of heaven girdled to death by a bittersweet vine, which was impressive because tree of heaven is also an invasive species, and I love to see them do my job for me. Over there on the left, you can see the fruits of bittersweet, which at one point were very popular to be made as wreaths around the fall, which really helped facilitate their spread. And it's also important to know that there's a native species of bittersweet that's Celestris scandens, and then there's the invasive bittersweet that is Celestris orbiculatus. And there's a pretty easy way to tell them apart. They're very similar looking as far as their leaves and their vining nature goes, but American bittersweet only produces flowers and fruits terminally on the vine, which just means that those only appear on the very end of the vine. Whereas with Oriental bittersweet, you have flowers and fruits that can be born in every single leaf axil, which is just where the leaf attaches to the central stem. So if you see in the center picture, every leaf has a couple of flowers coming out. And if you just think about this for a second, if the American species only has fruits that grow in one spot along the whole vine, and the other one can have fruits that grow along the entire vine, one of those is probably going to have an advantage in overloading the genetic material of the area and spreading itself. And birds love to eat these fruits, and then birds love to fly around and do what birds do and leave you evidence of their flying around all over your yard. And in the interest of time, I'm going to skip buckthorn. And this one, real quick, this is my happy note to end on. Purple loosestrife, once the poster child of invasive species, as I mentioned, at one point was the most common wetland plant in the United States, which is not good because it's not from here. Each individual plant can produce over 150,000 seeds, which is like an incredible fecundity. Very pretty flowers, very common. It's a member of the mint family, so it's got those distinct square stems. And I'm not even going to talk about the control because now there are 3 biocontrol beetles that have been released and existing in New York State that are very effective on purple loosestrife. Gallericella, I think is how you pronounce that. My specialty is not etymology, so I can't tell you that that's how that's pronounced properly, but there's 3 different beetles. One feeds on the flower buds, one feeds on the leaves, another one feeds on the roots. And essentially, these have done such an effective job in the environment that purple loosestrife now acts as a naturalized species instead of an invasive species. These beetles have done enough to successfully pull back the reins on purple loosestrife, so now it exists within the environment without being at the expense of the environment. And in some instances, by removing an isolated population of purple loosestrife, you may be doing more harm than good, because that isolated population could act as a jumping point for the beetles to colonize and access new areas that they haven't been able to access yet, which is exciting. And this is one because this is like what the golden example of the end game of an invasive species management can be. Biocontrols aren't easy to study. They're not easy to release. They're not easy to get approved for release. But really outsourcing the work to animals that don't need to be paid is what we need to. That's really what it comes down to. That's the golden ticket for getting rid of this. And this is just one last thing to say that if you choose to use any pesticide, whatever that bottle of pesticide says on the label is the law. It doesn't matter what I say. Doesn't matter what your friend Bob says. You will be held accountable to whatever the instructions are on that label, and you should make sure to read it so that you can be not in trouble if you do anything bad. Invasive species are a big problem, but we want to work on them because we want to keep our environments nice. Not for us necessarily, but for my kids, my kids' kids, your kids' kids, and they tell 2 friends, and they tell 2 friends, and they tell 2 friends. And we want to, I love the natural world. I love being outside, and I want more people to be, I want the outside to function in a way that people can enjoy it the way that I get to and enjoy it. So there's a lot of things that you can do. You can go to your favorite park, go to your favorite preserve, any outdoor space you love, go, look around. If you see an invasive species that you recognize from this, report it. You can use IMAP invasives. And if you want to know more about that, send me an email. I can show you the world if I can quote Aladdin briefly. If you've got an invasive species in your yard and in your garden, try to remove it, replace it with natives. I also have, at request, I will share with anybody, I have lists, I have papers from our organization or other organizations that show you an invasive species and a good native alternative that you can do instead. Really, knowledge is the most powerful thing, and not only doing it on your own property, but if you have a friend and they've got a burning bush, be like, hey, you're going to make that guy Addison cry if you don't get rid of your burning bush. That always works on everybody, I promise. It worked on my mom for my entire childhood. And the main thing you can do is go native, become aware. Native plants help facilitate pollinators. We have a whole pollinator crisis happening right now, but we don't really address it. That we have so much area that is dedicated to either asphalt, grass lawns, or invasive ornamental things that provide no benefit to pollinators whatsoever. And we don't really understand the concept. Well, we do. A lot of people don't understand the long-term consequences that those type of things can have. So if you remove the invasives, if you remove them, get rid of the seeds and the flowers before you remove them, so that way you don't accidentally spread those. Don't share your invasive cuttings. Don't tell your friend about, oh, look, this really beautiful plant I got. It's got these great red leaves in the fall. I'll give you a cutting. Please don't do that. I've got lists I can give you of native plant nurseries throughout New York State. We've got some in Vermont, some in Massachusetts. I will give those to anybody and everybody. And also, everything I just showed you is also available on our website. I'm 90% sure of that. But if it's not on there, just email me. And speaking of my email, there's my email. And you should write it down. Or you can take a picture of it. Or I'm sure Sarah can facilitate that as well. Or you can Google me. I have a very specific name. There's not a lot of Addison Kubiks out there. I'll be honest with you. You'll get like 13 top Google hits and they're all going to be me. And I think that's really all I got for you. And I only went slightly longer than I wanted to. So I'll take any questions for as much time as there is available, I suppose.
That was great. If you stop screen share and people can unmute themselves to go ahead and see each other and ask questions.
All right, stop sharing. All right, cool. I did it. Fantastic.
So if you have a question, go ahead or hold your hand up. And I could start with one real quick while everybody else is thinking about theirs. That was great that you have a list of nurseries because ECOS is trying to a task force that addresses lawns and changing the paradigm of how we see lawns as something we're doing. And we need to give people alternatives, instead of like, I loved when you were saying spice bush instead of the other. And if we can get those lists and get those on our pages too, and it would be nice, even the nurseries that are not specializing in natives, if maybe we could get some of them just to have those substitute lists available to the public.
I will send you so much. Like because this is like native plants are. I didn't get into invasive species because I love hating invasive species. I got into invasive species because I love conserving native plants. And that's sort of where this all comes from, because but like to just tell somebody that that's bad, get rid of it, without the second part of the process, you need both hands to sort of come together to be like, remove this and then put this in, because that's just how human psychology works. That's
right. And then that crucial third step is where you go to get that. So
yes, exactly. And it's all about, we're trying to remove the barriers to understanding these things, because on the best day, we're all dealing with so much just outside of all of this stuff. It's really easy to forget or get frustrated and then be like, I don't have the time for this right now. I'm just going to move on. But to try to get everything lined up in one place, that's it. And actually, it's funny that you said that. We just developed in our office a whole presentation about sort of shifting your yard focus to creating a more sustainable, pollinator-friendly yard.
excellent.
Which is great. That's because it's like you said, just to tell people that, oh, your yard is bad, get rid of it. Okay. Then what do I do? It's like many things, it's a really daunting task to just look at all of the possibilities that lie ahead of you and try to pick one.
Yeah.
That's basically impossible. That's why invasive species can be so difficult. It's an incredibly overwhelming issue to face when you're like, there's so much to know, there's so much to be vigilant for, and it requires a level of constant vigilance. But I see a raised hand, so I think Bob should talk, so I stop.
Bob?
Well, a question I have, just in the past year, I came across the concept of forest gardening, and the notion of being able to put plants together, like companion plantings and stuff, so that you could have plants in your yard that like support each other enough so that there's relatively little maintenance, and it protects more against things like invasive plants.
Yes.
Any good sources for learning more about that kind of notion of having a more sustainable yard?
I don't know of anything right off the top of my head about how to, like, I don't know if there's any quick resource that I know off the top of my head that would give you good examples of like these plants pair together well. I'm sure that exists somewhere. It has to. I will check in to see if I can find that, because I would love to, I would like to have that for myself, and I would also like to share that with you if I can find that.
Yeah. I haven't really searched for it yet, but it was interesting reading about that. There's evidence that was before modern day agriculture started, where you would plant a field, because that there was agriculture in tropical areas where they planted in between trees. And
there's often
hunter-gatherers or foragers. They actually had gardens in tropical areas between trees, and that was the original forest gardening. And somebody in Britain in the 1980s developed something for temperate zones, and the notion of being able to plant things together so you could get food crops and have them be, like perennials or things that would seed themselves. So you could do gardening and actually have, some food in from your garden.
And it plays into that whole resiliency thing, where if you have multiple plants working together, you've got a stronger system. Because I talked about monocultures in the context of invasive species, but a large monoculture of genetically identical corn is no less unstable than a large monoculture of bittersweet is. It takes one virus to wipe out all the bananas that are all genetically identical, or all of the russet potatoes that are all genetically identical. Biodiversity, genetic diversity, these are great things in really all facets. And I've seen a lot of interesting stuff recently about people sort of trying to shift farming tactics to be more along the lines of kind of what you were just talking about, where you're planting crops together that maybe this crop doesn't provide food for us, but this crop provides optimal conditions for this valuable crop, and we can have higher yields with less of this crop by putting it next to this one, or things of that nature. The world is a magical place, and life is a fantastic thing, and there is a biological answer somewhere, always. I am constantly fascinated by life in all of the forms that it takes, and all of the synergies therein.
Addison, I'm going to say thank you for your time and knowledge. I got to take off, but it was a very interesting presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for joining. Thank you.
Done. Anybody else have a question? Nancy? Nancy's got her hand up.
Yeah, I was thinking about one of the things I really like about living in Schenectady is the Central Park, which has a number of little woodlots. And one of the things I've noticed in the little woodlots is the invasive bittersweet, which seems to be taking over. And I was just, I don't know, in a public park like that, whether, budgets are very limited in terms of dealing with stuff like that, I suppose. And it's such a problem because it's so difficult to deal with. Of course, volunteers, if we could, maybe for Earth Day or something, we could get a group of volunteers to, I don't know. You didn't really talk that much about getting rid of Oriental bittersweet, but it certainly is, I think, a difficult problem almost.
Bittersweet is a very labor intensive removal. Luckily, it doesn't require a lot of chemicals, but just this past summer, two of my friends bought a house, and their property was just overrun with bittersweet. And since I'm their friend, they got to get me to help them do a lot of the work for free. And it was like 4 days of just like cutting, ripping
Yeah.
out stems. Like if you've got it if it's growing up in trees, which can be a problem too, because it gets up into trees,
Yeah.
it adds excess weight into the branches, making them less stable if there's wind or ice. A good thing to do, and it's one thing on your property, on other property, you've got to get the permission if whoever's it is. But if it's up in a tree and you just cut the vine as high as you can reach it and as low to the ground as you can reach it, if you cut that vine, it's going to cut off its supply to its root system. So everything above that cut will die. And if you just try to make that split in the cuts as big as possible, so the plant can't reconnect itself up when it goes up again. But bittersweet is one that is very feasible to do with a volunteer removal. And I happen to know the guy who helps all the volunteers at the Capital Region PRISM. If you guys ever need any help with something like that, I don't know who that would be, but it's me.
Yeah, we're talking about Schenectady Central Park. Yeah, we've been dealing with Willie Dean, who's the new Parks Department head of Schenectady, and he's very energetic and very, very responsive. And we've been working with him pretty closely on some of the other Central Park stuff. So he'd probably be a good contact if we want to get in touch with PRISM to start attacking that. And one other point, like it was interesting to hear, there's a stand of Japanese knotweed in the Mohawk State Park. Well, actually in the town land behind the dump on the Mohawk State Trails that I administer. And yeah, I've been hacking it back a couple times a year, and I think he just told me that's the wrong approach. So
but hey, now you know.
Well, yeah, I should be contacting the town to get their help to eradicate it.
It's I wish I could tell you that it's going to be easy.
Yeah, yeah, because it literally takes at least twice a year. I've got to go and cut it all just to maintain the path through it. So yeah, that a different approach is probably warranted.
Which agency brought that in? You said it was originally brought over, like kudzu was, for erosion control, and kudzu also is not actually good for erosion control. But which agency did that?
I don't have that information right off the top of the dome. But that's one of the really interesting things about conservation work, is that a lot of the stuff we're doing right now is sort of trying to fix what people 100 years ago thought was the right thing to do also. Like there's a lot of massive Norway spruce plantations here that the CCC put up 100 years ago. There's a bunch of Scotch pine, and granted, is that an ideal forest that is super productive? No, but it's still better than what the unclaimed farmland would probably have been over the past 100 years without those trees in there. Maybe I'm just trying to rationalize it because it's the thing we're stuck with now. And so much of what we tried, like not that long ago, common buckthorn was a thing that was like pushed to people to multiflora rose. Oh, it's a great natural barrier to put in this highway medium. Cool, it rips a hole in my pants every single time. It's the worst. And so many of these things were the product of good intent, which is, I just really hope nobody curses my name in 100 years with the decisions that I've made. I hope that they're not just like, no, you should have been mowing the knotweed. Why did you tell people not to?
Bob, did you have a question?
Well, not so much a question. It was a couple of comments. One is about bittersweet. The house and yard that I had before my current residence had a terrible bittersweet problem. Well, we had Japanese knotweed also on the property, and one of the things was that with the bittersweet is pulling up roots because it has root runners like crazy.
Bananas, how long they can be.
You can identify, you can tell it's bittersweet by the bright orange roots that it has.
Which are really cool, actually. I have a piece of one on my mantle to warn the others.
Yeah, and bittersweet is a problem at a number of parks in Schenectady. go walking regularly in the park, in the different parks, and it's not only in Central Park, it's in a number of the parks.
There's a lot of places
Killing
during the
trees.
fall. Yeah, like it'll be a tree that is completely, the whole canopy is all bittersweet. And you're like, oh, I didn't realize that red maples were yellow in the fall. Oh, that's just a bunch of bittersweet in a tree.
Yeah, the golf course, I think they've got rid of a lot of the bittersweet. I don't know. I haven't spent as much time there as I used to, but I just remember seeing a whole crown of the tree covered with bittersweet on the golf course.
Any other questions?
Oh, the other thing is it Norway?
Norway maple.
It was one of the things that I read about forest gardening, that they said if you have a smaller lot, you don't, they have something like 9 different levels of plants for a yard, all the way from big trees to underground to vines, like plants that live at different levels. And they said for Norway maples, because they were so large and their cover is so dense, it's very hard to grow much of anything else underneath them. My neighbor has a huge one that their backyard is almost completely bare of plants because it's such a huge, dense cover. And that, I don't know if it's not really an invasive species, but I understand that was planted around because of the bright colored leaves and stuff. But it's a real pain because it's right next to my yard, and I get
Norway maple is
little
one of those
whirly bird
things that
thingies, and
it's like on the cusp between sleeper and invasive. We've been seeing it start to, at least in this area, invade forests more, just because, like, I'm sure you notice how like super ridiculously heavy the fruit load is on Norway maple compared to your sugars, your red maples, your black maples. Not only that, basically the only tree that you got right now that still has leaves on it is Norway maples that are just all over the place. I don't think I'm not a huge Norway maple fan. I'll take a sugar maple any day.
Yeah.
And most Norway maples I see, Norway maple gets tar spot every time. Like, I always see Norway maple leaves covered in tar spot. They have a pretty shallow root system compared to other maple trees. They have latex-like substances in their leaf tissue that can cause mild reactions. No bueno, in my opinion.
yeah.
And nothing can grow under them. Nobody wants that.
Well, yeah, all the seeds too. It's like every year pulling out. I pull them out by the roots, because if you, like on lawns, if you just mow them, then you get the little stubble that when you can't walk
Exactly.
bare feet on
I've
your
got some of that right
yard,
here.
otherwise they stick you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, any other questions or comments?
I have a question.
Mhm.
Addison, I worked with
Hey!
you at Glowagie.
Hey,
That's
yeah, you watched me go to town on some of those honeysuckles. Actually, you were there in person.
It was beautiful. Yeah. I was just
you.
wondering, I've been hiking a lot in the Adirondacks, as everyone else probably. And I was curious, I've heard about beech leaf disease, and I noticed the understory, there's only beeches. Obviously, it's a lot more visible because they're the only ones that have leaves. Is that something that we should be worried about?
I was trying not to end on a bummer, Matt. Yes. Beech leaf disease is one of the things that sort of keeps me up at night a little bit. So, very briefly to get into this. So, we all know the American beech. Traditionally beautiful trees, very robust, this beautiful smooth bark. They have been under threat by beech bark disease for decades at this point. Beech bark disease has functionally changed the way that beeches act in the landscape. What beech bark disease does, it's It's a complex of two different organisms. There's a scale insect that feeds on the bark, which is relatively harmless. But what that feeding does is that is an opening for another novel fungus, Neonectria, to go in. And that's a canker fungus, which causes the cankers along the whole trunk of the tree. That disrupts the vascular system of the tree. All of the above ground portion of the tree dies. The root system stays alive. And in response to the lack of flow through its vascular system, it sends up shoots, which create the beech thickets, which are very common factors of beech forests now, where you just have a bunch of small beech. Typically, they can't get, in areas where beech bark disease is really bad, they don't get that big before they die off. But the good thing about beech bark disease is that it doesn't actually kill the tree, it just changes the way that the tree functions. Beech leaf disease is a very new pathogen discovered in Ohio in 2012. There's a lot we don't know about it, but it has a causal relationship with a novel species of nematode called Lidylenchus crenatae mccanii. Write that down, it's going to be on the test later. And it originates in the Pacific Rim, and basically what the feeding, from what we understand from most of the more recent papers that I've read, the nematodes infect the leaf buds before the buds come out. They feed on the mesophyll tissue of the leaf, which is like the middle part of the leaf, for lack of a better term. And before they feed on it, they have some sort of relationship with other endosymbionts we don't understand, that thickens the leaf so that they have more to feed on. And that thickening of the leaf obstructs the leaf's ability to photosynthesize. So that, like, the most common symptom for beech leaf disease is if you're walking under the canopy, you look up at the beech leaves, there'll be really dark banding in between the veins of the leaf, and that's that mesophyll tissue being thicker. And that thick mesophyll tissue that is present from bud break to leaf senescence, whenever that does happen. But eventually it obstructs the plant's ability to photosynthesize, and a mature beech can die in about 6 to 10 years, and an understory beech will die in about 2 to 3 years. And the difference between this mortality versus with beech bark disease is that beech leaf disease kills the tree completely. No root system stays alive, nothing. And in an interesting interaction, there are now many more understory beech than would traditionally be present because of the way beech bark disease has affected beech trees. So now there are even more understory beech, which allows for even faster mortality of them from beech leaf disease. And yeah, beech leaf disease is a real bummer. That is one that I think about and worry about a lot. That is one that if you are ever out, monitor for that. Anytime you see a beech tree, I spend half of my time hiking in a beech stand, just doing this, which doesn't feel great after a while, but it gets the job done. If you ever do think you see beech leaf disease, and if you're interested, email me. I can send you some information about it. I have done so much reading about it because it worries me deeply. And over the past several decades, there's been a lot of work to sort of identify genetically resistant trees, beech trees, for beech bark disease. But now beech leaf disease has basically rendered all of that research moot, because now it doesn't matter if they're resistant to beech bark disease, because beech leaf disease will kill them anyway. Oh. And thanks for making me bum everybody out, Matt.
Of course.
But yeah, beech leaf disease is a really big issue. Try to keep an eye out for it, and if you see it, report it. And if you're interested, I can send you information about how to look for it.
Well, that was really interesting. Sorry on the bummer last note, but I like the beetle ending better. That was like the Hollywood version of the ending.
Yeah, right. I was trying, but reality always finds its way in.
So I have a bunch of things after some time next week or so. I'll get in touch with you, or maybe after Thanksgiving, and lots more information that I want to get to include on the ECOS website and so forth. So this was really interesting. Thank you very much.
Yes, and thank you everybody for choosing to spend your Thursday with us also.
So just two quick notes. We don't have a speaker for December because instead we have our holiday open house, and you'll be getting an email about that, and it's on our website. That's the Tuesday, December 12th, 6 to 8. And our January speaker will be Capital Roots. So that should also be another good one.
Email should have gone out today if you didn't see it.
Say again?
The email for the holiday get together should have gone out today. I think it's in my mailbox, so hopefully you saw it.
Okay, sounds good. All right, well, thank you again, Addison. That was just great, really informative.
Thank you, everybody. And let's do more work together. I think I like this group.
We're a very likable group. So, all
It's a
right,
great start.
I will be in touch with you soon.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Good night.